Hey guys, welcome back for another social studies lesson. Today's lesson is on the plague, and definitely some similarities that you're probably going to draw upon between the plague and what we're going through right now. In no way, shape, or form are they even close. They are completely different animals. The plague being much worse, obviously, than the thing we're going through right now. But still some similarities that we can draw upon and maybe even learn from, what happened back during the medieval world with the plague and, their response to it. We can analyze their response and kind of look at what worked and what didn't work. And in some way, shape, or form, the same things that they did that did work are the things that we're doing today. Today, ironically, the plague is not that big of a deal. At least this form of the plague, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, because we have treatment for it. Okay, during the medieval world, there was no treatment. All right, and so if you contracted it, you had a very high likelihood that you would not survive. So, with that said, let's jump right in here. I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about the plague and stop and compare what's going on now to what happened then. All right, and maybe you can draw some similarities yourself here. So, the plague is also known as the Black Death and the bubonic plague. When we say plague, most people, when they hear the word plague, this is what they're talking about. They're all the same thing. All right, the nickname of the bubonic plague is the Black Death. All right, it's called the Black Death because one of the symptoms or signs of having the bubonic plague was you formed black lesions on your body, and so if you formed those black lesions, you most likely were going to die, and so that's why they nicknamed it the Black Death. So, but for short, most people just call it the plague. So that's what I'm going to be referring to it as the plague. All right. So the plague starts around 1347 to 1353 in Europe. I think a lot of people fail to realize that the plague wasn't just contained to just Europe. It wasn't just going on in Europe. It was going on in other places of the world as well, especially Asia, right, and the Middle East, Africa. It was really a pandemic at this time. This is one of the world's major pandemics, and nobody was really safe from it. If there was ports and people were trading, you weren't really necessarily safe. Obviously, in the Americas, Europeans hadn't yet discovered this continent, so the natives living here, they weren't subjected to the plague. So it comes from parts of Asia, all right? And in fact, I believe, and going back on what I've learned about it, enters through the ports in Italy, Venice, I believe, and when a ship arrives, there are a ton of people on the ship that were dying or dead, and some of the rats could have gotten off from the ship because, and when I say rats, what causes it, really what causes the plague originally was the flea that they were on the rats. These rats boarded ships in ports of Asia, and if these rats or fleas bit individuals, they themselves would come down with the plague, and from there they can spread it human to human. All right. So, but the original thing that caused the plague was actually the flea on the rat. All right. And so, once the fleas on the rats had transferred this to humans, then it spread from person to person. And there are a number of reasons what caused the plague to become as bad as it does. One of the largest reasons is that Europe at the time was really crammed together, lots of cities, and they had terrible construction. Homes were built right on top of one another. You had very close proximity to one another. Sickness as a whole was very high in the medieval world because sanitation was so poor and people lived very close together in the cities, right? And so the plague found a perfect place to spread in this type of environment. And so when it did reach the cities, these merchants unloading their goods, whether they themselves had the plague or these rats got off and eventually the fleas bit people and then it spread from there, whatever the case may be, it does start to spread. And it starts off in the port areas and then spreads inland, right? Because the ports were the areas that the ships were getting to first. And then people traveled from city to city, usually merchants, all right, but regular people as well, traveling from city to city, I suppose. And they would spread it even more so from place to place inland. But it took longer to get there. But poor sanitation was a huge concern because, you know, people at the time in the medieval world, their homes, not only were they very close and built one on top of each other in the cities, but they didn't have plumbing. You know, the Romans had plumbing. They lost that idea. They lost that concept. So plumbing had went away, and in its place, people took really they took their waste, whether that be their excrement or that be leftovers from food, they just threw it out the window. All right, and so you have, you know, all these animals that came in and ate this food. But you can imagine people walking down the street and you're walking over or around or through the leftovers and the excrement of people. It must have stank horribly. But besides the stink, you had the bacteria, all right, and you had the animals running around eating the leftovers, and so it was absolutely disgusting. There's a reason why a lot of people didn't live very long in the medieval world, and there's a reason why childhood mortality rates were so high. They had no concept of bacteria and proper sanitation. And so, you know, this is a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. It is a perfect breeding ground for viruses. And in this case, the plague will find its mark, especially in Europe. So, places that were hit the hardest were the cities. And in the countryside, you know, it popped up from here to here in smaller villages, but the cities were hit the hardest because there were more people living close together. All right, so if you got the bubonic plague, what were some of the symptoms then might you have had? And you might have started off with, you know, flu-like symptoms. You had the chills, you had a high fever, you were very weak, things that would resemble the flu, right? But in addition to that, you would experience abdominal pain. You would be bleeding from multiple different areas, and really, this is the tipping point. You know, you have these symptoms, people are experiencing them, but there was still a chance for you to recover. All right, if you got to around this stage, your body could potentially form a resistance to it, and then you would start to get better. Remember, it didn't kill everybody, but it killed around half of the people that got this virus. And so at that point, you would start to get better if your body had built up a resistance to this and antibodies to it. If, however, your body did not, it would continue to attack your body and get worse and worse. And the final stages of this virus would you would grow black legions on your body. That's where the Black Death comes from, and they would grow in number and they would grow in size, and some of them would pop. They would get to a point where they would pop, and they would ooze out, and you'd be infected by you would have pus and blood coming out of these legions. In fact, they used to call them boo-boos. So the word boo-boo, you know, when you could scrape your knee or something, a little kid comes up and say, "I got a boo-boo," right? A boo-boo is actually like a plague legion. That's where the word boo-boo comes from, because it's the bubonic plague. All right, and so these legions were called boo-boos. So you might not have known that. That's kind of a fun fact. If you got to this point, death would follow. You wouldn't get better once you developed this advanced stage of symptoms, and you were obviously highly contagious at this point. Any of those boo-boos on your body would be, you know, infected, and somebody who touched it, they themselves could get infected as well. Um, so then, when people started to experience this, what was their reaction? How did people react to this plague? And at first, being in a world that was so filled with religion, the response was, "We need to pray it away. We need to pray it away. This is something that was sent by God for our punishment, our sinful ways," because people were always very conscientious about sin. And so they thought that God had sent this plague on the people to punish them for their sinful ways. And so what did they do? They gathered together and they prayed in mass to get rid of this. Probably the worst thing you could do, because obviously this is spreading human. People who have it, they're spreading it maybe through the act of communion, the act of maybe just greeting one another. So it was probably not a very good idea, but again, this is the time period where faith is extremely important, and people don't have the knowledge that we have today about sickness and disease and things like that. So it made sense to them. It made sense to them at the time. Today, we scratch our heads going, obviously, that was not a good idea. But back then, it did. All right, but it won't last forever. People will start to realize, they're taking care of their loved ones, or they know friends who have it, and they know that people are taking care of them. They realize that people who come into contact with the sick are the ones that tend to develop symptoms of their own. And so it'll take a little bit of time, but